Hello, George, and hello, everybody. Today we are meeting to talk about the leadership of Atatürk, and as we in Turkey have celebrated the 100th birthday of the Great Offensive, which is the Büyük Taarruz in Turkey, and in about 8 days' time, we will celebrate the independence of İzmir, the survival of İzmir in a way. So I'm from İzmir. I'm here in my Çeşme summer home, and we're all preparing for the 100th birthday of İzmir's independence. George is an emeritus professor of history, and he will be talking to us about his book here, The Young Atatürk, about Atatürk's leadership, and also about the last days of the war, how the war progressed, and how we came to today in 2022. Hello, George. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to see you again. A few years ago, we were in the USA, Texas, visiting George at his office and at his library, and we had done an interview there, our first interview. And since then, we've had a lot of communication back and forth about his work. Now, I'd like to shortly tell everyone about you, George. George Gawrych is a retired emeritus professor of history from Baylor University, and he taught there over 20 years. Also, as the U.S. Army Commandant General Staff College professor, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He did a year of visiting, teaching as a professor at the United States Military Academy. He is the author of many books, Crescent and the Eagle, Ottoman Rule, Islam and the Albanians, 1874 to 1913, The Albatross of Decisive Victory, War and Policy between Egypt and Israel in the 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli Wars. And he also co-authored The Armed Peacekeepers in Bosnia. But I know George very well with this book here called The Young Atatürk, From Ottoman Soldier to Statesman of Turkey. And with this book, George received the Distinguished Book Award for Military Biography in 2014 from the Society for Military History. And here is the same book translated into Turkish, Genç Atatürk, Osmanlı Zabitinden Türk Devlet Adamına. And by the way, this is his photograph I like the best, my favorite photograph. So, hello, George, welcome again. As this is the 100th birthday of the Great Offensive, let's start with the days or the whole year before the Great Offensive, which is the year between the Sakarya Battle and the Great Offensive. What happened during that whole year? And then shortly, what happened during this last offensive? After the 30th, which is the victory holiday here that we celebrate, the Turkish army, military, went all the way to İzmir. So let's talk about those days. Arrival in İzmir to Mudanya, and then whatever else you'd like to talk about. Now, my framework here, doing these programs, is to celebrate the leadership of Atatürk, as I am a lecturer of leadership and management. And I do very much admire the leadership of Atatürk. He's not a pro-war person. He'd rather not have war, if possible. And I'd like to start this conference with one of his quotations, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's quotation. He says, "If war is not for the independence or survival of a nation, it is murder." And this is my framework too. Lots of young people die, people of all ages, even children end up dying in a war. So let's rather, we are going to talk about war, of course, but as much as possible, let's have a peaceful narrative following Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's peaceful line, like he says, peace in the country, peace in the world, and hope for a peaceful world. So, welcome again, and please share all your experience with this part of the history.
Berna, thank you very much. I'd like to put briefly the Battle of Sakarya in context in terms of Atatürk's leadership. He enters Anatolia on 19th of May as a soldier, but the main part of this early period is devoted to building legitimacy for his national resistance movement. He has to establish himself as a national leader, and what he does is he holds congresses, first in Erzurum and then Sivas, showing that what is happening in Anatolia is becoming a national movement with popular support. And the congresses, each of them clarify what the goal is, which is to gain keep independence and the unity of the country. And then there is the big election, which creates the last Ottoman parliament. And when parliament comes together, they basically agree to the National Pact, which is outlining what Atatürk's vision was independence and territorial integrity. So first part of the struggle is really Atatürk state building and building legitimacy and wearing civilian clothes, which is very different from his military uniform. And to kind of lead into the Battle of Sakarya very briefly, to me, what struck me is the 16th of July, there is a Marif Congress, an education congress, and he gives a speech to this Congress. In other words, he's thinking and building the state, and he has teachers there, and he's telling them there are two wars we're fighting. The war we're fighting against the enemy who has invaded us, but we're also fighting a war of ignorance, and your role is going to be important. Don't feel yourself left out of this struggle. And as he's giving the speech, all of a sudden word comes that the army is being defeated in parts out on the Western Front. So after his speech, he immediately runs out to try to salvage what is happening out there on the Western Front against the Greeks. So it is really interesting that he's thinking as a statesman for the future, building the state, and then he has to handle a crisis on the battlefield. During this critical period, he puts himself up to become Başkomutan, commander-in-chief, and the parliament gives him authority to make military decisions so that they could be done rapidly, and he puts on his uniform. He has been directing the military struggle up until then, but now he has the uniform and he's going to take on full responsibility to go and organize the army and defend Ankara as the Greek army is going to be moving toward taking the provisional capital. So it is important then to see that what we see with Atatürk is very much in kind of the spirit, if you will, the example of Frederick the Great and Napoleon, who are statesmen in control of a state, whereas he's building one in opposition to what's in Istanbul. And he's going to be a field commander like Frederick the Great and Napoleon. He's going to be on the battlefield. He's going to be seeing it. So this is unusual to have something like that happening in modern warfare in the 19th and 20th century. It's usually like the Tsar is in the rear.
Yeah.
He's making decisions, but he's in the rear. He's not seeing the battle like Atatürk will look at through his binoculars and observe what's going on.
Yes.
And this battle is going to be important for saving the capital. So he will take personal command and will work with İzmir İnönü and Fethi Çakmak to manage this battlefield. And each of those commanders will help him. So it's a effort of senior commanders working together with Atatürk to make decisions. And Fethi plays an important role during this struggle because he says, it looks like the Greeks are retreating or pulling back. We don't need to pull back. I think we've turned the tide. So for 21 days, Atatürk, with his ribs hurting, is going to be managing the battlefield. And the army is going to have trouble holding the line. Sometimes there'll be movements of pulling back, and Atatürk will continue to try to monitor things and plug up the holes. A defensive battle is easier to fight than an offensive battle. The enemy has to keep attacking him, and his soldiers basically have to defend, and they will do an amazing job defending despite all the different attacks against them over this 21-day period. As the Greek army is pulling back after the Battle of Sakarya, Atatürk will have not enough resources to pursue them in any effective way. So the Greeks will withdraw, destroying things along the way, and then create a defensive line in Western Anatolia. What Atatürk has done is he has defended the capital, an important, decisive, defensive battle. He will renew his 3-month extension for being commander-in-chief of the forces. And what will happen is the Greeks will settle down into defensive positions, and the strategic initiative now is in Atatürk's hands. They're not going to attack him. They're going to try to just hold what they have left in Western Anatolia. So for Atatürk,
decide not to attack, but do they ever consider withdrawing instead of staying?
No. It would be a political disaster back in Athens to withdraw. I mean, the leadership is caught into this. So eventually what will happen is a military coup will take place and kick out the Greek government, blaming them for the fiasco that takes place. Now, Atatürk has to think as a military commander, but also as a statesman. So one of the things he does is he takes advantage of the military victory to reach an agreement with France. France agrees to pull out of Anatolia, agrees to hand over military supplies, and Atatürk agrees to have concessions that the French will be able to do some help in the reconstruction that takes place in Anatolia after the war. So he has moved from the military victory to take advantage diplomatically and take France out of the war. What that means then is he's left with Greece and Britain as his main adversaries. As a military commander, he understands the problem facing the Turkish army, the national army. To wage an offensive campaign is very difficult when your whole history has been basically defensive in the last century with minimal offensive tradition. He understands that it's going to take time, and he takes a full year to get the army ready, knowing that if it goes longer, it might lead to demoralization because winter will come and you don't want to fight in the winter. So he basically has to rebuild this army and get it to be able to think offensively, to train offensively, and to be able to attack. So this is where his energy will have to be faced. And some people are saying, well, you got to move things faster. Well, he tells Parliament, this can't happen overnight. So the year up until the Great Offensive will be training the army, training the officers, building morale, and coming up with a plan that will defeat the Greeks. The goal is not just to defeat them in part, but to defeat them in a decisive battle, because you don't want to enter into another battle like Sakarya, where you fight for long days and the enemy can pull back again and still hold on to parts of Western Anatolia, including your loved hometown of Izmir. So
he is a very good soldier. He is a very good leader, considering all these details you've talked about. He makes a good plan.
Exactly. So he has done some amazing things politically as a leader, statesman, building a parliamentary system with legitimacy, state building, bringing the army and the bureaucracy together under his command in Anatolia, reaching treaties with the Soviet Union, an agreement with France, in the process waging war, and now after the Battle of Sakarya, building an army for the Great Offensive. What will be important is the understanding that if you want to have a victory, a decisive victory in battle, you cannot lock yourself into a battle of attrition. So what he will do is he will design, with the help of his officers, a campaign plan that, if you noticed, there's a defensive line, let's say north of Eskişehir here, going all the way to Afyonkarahisar and underneath. Rather than do frontal assaults, he's going to go what we call the underbelly, to try to hit behind Afyon, because if you start hitting behind Afyon, you're going to make the front line of Greek troops vulnerable to attack from the rear and break their morale. So his job will be to deceive the enemy to think that he's not going to attack yet. He does diplomatic initiatives to suggest he wants to see if he can get a diplomatic solution. He attends a soccer match, things like that, to try to get the Greeks to lull themselves into thinking he's not about to attack. Meanwhile, he's going to move his army secretly so that in this underbelly, he's going to have 110,000 soldiers facing 40,000 Greeks. He's got basically a 3-to-1 advantage. So when he attacks, he's got enough of an advantage in soldiers that he should be able to break through. And once you break through into the rear, the front lines start to panic and then starts to collapse. So let's see what happens. As I mentioned, he took on this uniform and they made him Ghazi after the victory at Sakarya. Yeah. Well, the Ghazi now is on Kocatepe, and he's seeing from that mountain what's going to be transpiring during daylight in the battle that's going to be taking place. It's going to be a campaign. He's not trying for a battle, but a campaign. So he observes what's going on, and the attack takes place. And it's not going to be easy to attack, and Greeks have some defensive positions. They're going to be shooting back and forth, but he's helping to direct, make some decisions, watching the battle, and a breakthrough starts to take place. And as that breakthrough starts to take place, the Greeks start to panic, and the senior commander starts to pull back his troops to save them and to try to create new defensive positions. What Atatürk has done, lacking really planes, lacking tanks, lacking trucks, he has used the cavalry under Fahrettin Pasha, created a cavalry corps of 10,000 horse soldiers. By the way, my dad was in the Polish cavalry with an Arabian stallion when World War II broke out, and he had to engage the Germans using a horse. So this cavalry corps is going farther into the rear to disrupt communication. So it is a beautifully orchestrated, planned campaign to hit into the rear and force the withdrawal rather than a battle of shooting, fighting, attrition, and little being gained in territory. Now, they're celebrating the great victory from the Turkish point of view, the 30th of August, right? Well, the army is starting to encircle because it's broken through from the east heading west. It's coming from the south, but the Greeks managed to sneak out because you can't link up well enough to encircle them and then crush them. So the Greek commander starts pulling out his forces. The 31st of August is spent kind of recuperating because it takes a lot of emotion, energy, and trauma when you're fighting to see soldiers around you wounded, both sides, dying.
Yeah.
So for the 1st of October, he issues his famous command. And in that command, he basically says, what is that famous command?
Go to the Mediterranean.
Yes.
Your first target is the Mediterranean.
Yeah, armies, your first goes to the Mediterranean, forward.
Yes.
Now, I
And
could talk
at
about the
time,
command.
There was no Aegean Sea. The Aegean Sea was called the Mediterranean 100
Right.
years ago.
So it's broad. It's a broad thing, which means if I'm saying go to Izmir and the Greek army pulls somewhere else, then what do I do?
Yes, it's
No,
all,
pursue the
always
army and
called.
head for the
I
Mediterranean.
will look.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Oh, so what struck me is when people talk about this command or write about it, they don't put it into context. What Atatürk does, he signs this command in his two hats. He is the Reis of the Grand National Assembly and the Başkomutan of the army. He takes and signs this order in both his capacities. But what is interesting is the order is not just for the army. It is going to be published the next day in Turkish newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a propaganda component to it to say to the world, I intuitively believe we have crushed and defeated the Greek army. We're pursuing it and we have won. And it's not just to encourage the army to keep pursuing, which they couldn't do in the Battle of Sakarya when they had held and forced the Greeks to pull. His army has been trained and prepared and large enough that it can continue the pursuit. But it is being not televised, telegrammed to the entire world. So he understands that I'm not only gaining a military victory, but I want to make a statement that it's going to be a political victory as well.
Yeah.
And he not only addresses the army on the 1st of September, but he addresses the nation and talks about, Turkish nation fighting, sacrificing, and we're winning. So there's a component that also goes to the nation, which he signs as Reis and Başkomutan, but it is also in the newspapers for the world to understand what is happening. An intuitive sense of timing, soldier, statesman working together while he's in uniform.
In parallel, yes.
Amazing.
Amazing.
But as these two declarations, one's an order, one's a declaration, are being published, the Turkish army, the national army, is capturing the southern commander.
Yes.
So, perfect timing, isn't it?
Yes.
As the world is learning, as the nation is being inspired, as the army is fulfilling day 2 what it's being told to do, it has captured the senior commander and his staff, which leads to total disaster for this army because there's no one to take over command.
Yeah.
in the south. So the order, pursue. And as you're pursuing, the Greek army with civilians, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, some of them, fleeing with them because they're afraid of the retribution that'll come in this emotional state where we've seen it on all sides, violence, killings, emotions. You can't control these things easily in a war
Yeah.
like this. And that,
Unfortunately.
unfortunately. So
It's
the
a
army
disaster. Mhm.
is pursuing. And what is happening then, the army, Greek army in the north, which really has so many troops compared to what the Turkish army has facing it around Eskişehir here, it's not going to attack us. What purpose would it be if we gain some land and the big battles down in the south? So once that army in the north realizes what has happened in the south, it starts to pull back without really major fighting.
Yeah.
So when they start pulling back, they're going to have to head not to Izmir to withdraw, but the Çanakkale area. And what is going to be happening is the army, the first army that has defeated the Greeks in the south, is going to move through Izmir and head to the north to force the Greek army out.
Yeah.
Now, I'll come back to Izmir a little bit. And what happens then is Atatürk brings that army up into the north, and the Greeks have been defeated, kicked out of Anatolia. He moves the army into the neutral zone in the Çanakkale area, and he's applying pressure to the allies. I've won, and I need a political victory, a diplomatic victory. And the Mudanya conference gives Turkey control of Anatolia and promises the withdrawal of Greeks from eastern Thrace. So he has attained major goals, except with the problem that the Allies are still in control of the Straits and Istanbul. Okay, so it's a major victory done by a statesman and a commander, defensive battle that's impressive in terms of holding, and an offensive campaign before you have the large number of planes and tanks, done mainly with horses and foot soldiers in a decisive campaign that starts on the 26th of August, and then the 9th of September, you're in Izmir. So from the point of view of military and political, you study this campaign, the War of Independence from the Turkish point of view, from the point of view of a very smart soldier statesman and how he conducts that resistance to win, and a pretty impressive offensive campaign designed to win in a decisive campaign, and it is pulled together to do that. Probably it could have been done better if the army was better trained. They could have probably encircled the army, Greek army, and not let it get to Izmir. But it's impressive for an army that hasn't done an offensive like this for a century.
Yes, I understand that a lot of young officers died in the Sakarya War. So a lot of young officers had to be trained from the start for the great offensive. And since the Balkan Wars, a lot of soldiers and officers had died. So Atatürk had the disadvantage of inexperienced soldiers and officers, and also less weapons, less tanks, less everything. That's all he could do.
Exactly. The benefit he did have is in senior level, and at senior level, generals usually don't get killed.
Yes.
So he had a cadre of experienced officers like Inanu and stuff who had commanded at higher levels. But you're right, at the level of junior officers, let's say lieutenant colonels, majors, captains, some of them have not even seen any battle because they've been conscripted. They're trained. Their training and education is short because we need them in uniform. Usually it took Atatürk 3 years to go through the military academy. They're doing this in, I think, 6 months of training. So it's very quick. He understood the limitations, so he had to be cautious, but he wanted to do a decisive battle, so he took a risk with a decisive campaign, concentrate the troops, attack, and follow it where it goes. So,
and it was risky. He could have lost. So there were some high ranking officers that were kind of resisting his line of attack. So Atatürk said, if we lose the war, hang me there and then immediately and put all the blame on me. So he knew he was taking a risk, but he knew that probably was his only option if he didn't want a very long war like Sakarya again and many wars. So he had to take the risk.
And he had to resist people who kept pushing him, do something, do something. Yes. Wait a minute, I can't rush this. I'm going to wait until toward the last possible opportunity to do this, because it takes time to get an army to think. What the Germans did, and they had a lot of war experience on the Western Front, they pulled back their army during a winter, trained them up to do offensive operations in 1918 out of desperation, because they knew America was coming into the war, but they knew that there was this defensive mindset in the army. And look, we're talking about very experienced army in terms of commanders, but soldiers, again, they're starting to get old people in there, and you have to train them. But they had a stronger tradition, so they could do it faster. But they couldn't do a decisive battle because they're attacking into the front. Whereas Atatürk could go for a weak point and concentrate, and then have the things start to collapse in the south, and the west is outmaneuvered. I mean, in the north, outmaneuvered, so it starts to withdraw eventually.
And because he couldn't encircle, and the Greeks could go towards what we call the Aegean Sea now, the Mediterranean at the time, they ended up burning a lot of villages and killing a lot of civilians. Okay, so we were talking, I was just saying that because Atatürk couldn't encircle the Greek army and they started running away towards the sea, they ended up killing civilians and burning villages, which is the sort of thing that happens in any war when people are running away in panic. So that takes us all the way to Izmir, 9th of September, and half of Izmir was burned, as well as the villages and towns on the way to Izmir. And up to this day, we don't know who burned Izmir and how it burned, but what we know is there was a very strong wind that made it very difficult to stop the fire. So now we've entered Izmir. This is the 9th of September. And let's continue from there onwards towards Mudanya. And maybe before we go on to Izmir and Mudanya, will you permit me to read a short paragraph from your book? This is Atatürk and the Greek general
Trikopis
meeting before Izmir. And here it is, your book. I want to read from your book, and I'm at the same time recommending everyone to read this book, either the English version or the Turkish version. According to Halide Edip, toward the end of the discussion, Mustafa Kemal offered words of comfort to Trikopis. War is a game of chance, General. The very best sometimes becomes the worst. You have done your best as a soldier, and an honorable man, the responsibility rests with chance. Do not be distressed. Salih Bozok, a staff officer, recorded Mustafa Kemal telling Trikopis, if you are convinced that you carried out your duty in accordance to your conscience, vicdan in Turkish, then you can be at peace with yourself. History has recorded even greatest commanders falling prisoner. I can, for example, show you Napoleon. His consoling words showed empathy toward his defeated adversaries. That empathy also extended toward the Greek soldiers. I was so happy to read this in your book in English and also in Turkish. So, while people die and bad things happen in war, empathy, vicdan, conscience, and good things can happen in war too. And we find a general trying to give confidence to a defeated general, which is, of course, very good. We in Turkey, up till this day, have come along in the steps of Atatürk, and with what he has taught us, we still see the Greeks and Greece as our neighbors and as our brothers, sisters. And whenever I travel to Greece, I get the same feeling, very friendly people. We get on very well. We share a lot of things in common, like food and food names and vocabulary. So even though on the political line, there may be fights between the politicians of Greece or Turkey, in terms of people, we are quite happy to be friends and to feel like brothers and sisters. So let's continue. Now we've arrived in Izmir, and Izmir is being liberated. There is a fire, and there are British ships in the bay. And as I understand, they first rescue the British people and not the Greek people. So again, at times of war and at times of panic, everyone ends up looking after himself rather than helping others. So tell us about Izmir and all the way to Mudanya Agreement.
Okay. Izmir's is a complicated subject because we don't have enough information with certainty to understand how the fire started. But from my perspective, if you look at, let's say, 3 areas that are important during this period, 3 cities, or 2 cities and a town. One is Istanbul, which is under foreign occupation. They escape the war. There is no real fighting taking place. Ankara is the provisional capital. It's a safe haven. And what Izmir to me represents is that, like you mentioned, the withdrawal of the Greeks and the damage that's done, then the Turkish army coming in, the fire, the killings that take place. Certainly the Turkish army had more weapons than the civilian population. So Izmir represents the devastation of war that was experienced throughout in parts of Anatolia, like the city of Adana. And it's the dark side. And it also represents Atatürk saying, the Mediterranean is your goal. It's also the place which is going to be very important for trade with Europe, with the peace. And it requires reconstruction, major reconstruction to do that. So there's another symbolism that Izmir has. It's a place where you need the reconstruction because of the devastation. And with Ataturk's westernization, it is your door, one of your important doors to the outside world. That significance, I think, really does come out with the Economic Congress that's held in Izmir from February 17th to March 4th of 1923. So in other words, Ataturk brings over over 1,000 delegates from different parts. They're not going to make any major decisions, but at least bringing people from different parts of Anatolia, Thrace, to talk with each other, to realize that there's going to have to be an effort made to rebuild. And he gives a very important speech to open the Congress. And in there, he talks about we need to be independent economically. So he sets a high goal, kind of an ideal, mefkure. Ülkü later on, I guess, is the more of a term. And he says, no matter how great the political and military victories, if they are not crowned with economic victories, the victories achieved cannot be permanent. They will fade in a short time. Here is what are the fruits of victory? Independence. But what are the challenges? Rebuilding. And he immediately embraces that vision, that mission, that purpose for building what will become the Republic.
This is leadership too, isn't it? It's a part of leadership.
Exactly. And in there, he has to recognize that in this industrial age, industrialization is what is giving Europe the ability to have so much of a colonial administration. This is the period in the 19th and the 20th century where the sun doesn't set on the British flag because it's everywhere, okay? He understands it. He says, we are a nation of farmers and shepherds. We have to start there and build. So he embraces the economic situation facing Turkey. It's going to be a tough road. And in there, he says we have to build education, will be an important means. So you can see the statesman now kind of, shedding his military uniform, shedding his military mindset, and saying, what have we fought for? To build a better country now. And we're going to have to do it with some material progress. That is in our agenda. So the Izmir liberation for the Turks, it is the end of the megala idea for the Greeks, the idea of the greater Greece, and it shows the culmination of the kind of violence through which the people of that region have gone through. Balkan wars, wars in Russia, World War I, Iraq and stuff like that, culminating in that kind of devastation, loss of human life in a place which had been conquered with little fighting. The first shots of the national resistance were really in Izmir, right?
Yes.
May 15th. But it now shows that in this victory, it was a bloody victory where innocent lives were lost and much devastation came. So Izmir starts the resistance and in a way culminates it in a very different place, but it represents the historical forces. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, what the people of Izmir have to face.
Yes. My grandmother comes from Izmir. She was 10 years old when the occupation started and 13, 14 years old when the occupation ended. She rarely spoke about those days because people tend to try to forget the difficult days, the bad days. So we find here our grandparents have talked very little about their suffering of different wars. Starting from the Balkan Wars to the Independence War. But there is one sentence which my grandmother used. I was in primary school, never forgot it. She said, because the Greeks drowned in the sea, they didn't eat fish for 2 years. they were so, they suffered so much during the years of occupation that by not eating fish, they tried to forget their suffering. But my grandmother, none of my grandparents held any grudges. They didn't have grudges. And as I say, they always think we are brothers with Greece and Greeks. On a political line, I think sometimes a country occupies another country, but deep down where there is humanity, people still help each other. We've seen it during the Second World War, some Germans helping the Jews, hiding the Jews, sort of thing. So on one hand, there is blood being spilled, but on the other hand, there is humanity, people trying to help each other. And I think a lot of that occurred during the occupation days of Izmir as well. So people don't end up holding grudges.
Yeah, there are the dark sides and the bright sides.
Right.
And those dark sides continue and the bright sides continue because there's a lot of still revenge in people's minds. And there's also people who are idealistic and humanitarian. It's very complicated. But the other thing that's interesting is the fire spreads and it threatens Atatürk where he is residing. So he finds a mansion to stay in, and then he finds Latife, who represents that cosmopolitan outreach, a woman who was sent abroad to study, which is amazing, and he ends up marrying her. It doesn't work, but it shows that that cosmopolitan outreach was there. So Izmir holds an important place
for Atatürk. And his mother is buried in Izmir as well.
Exactly, that's true too. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And in the long run, he replaces the Istanbul government. He has in many ways discredited it, but there are still people who want to hold on to the caliph and the sultanate, but he establishes the republic. And I think it's important to see that out of this defeat comes a struggle.
Yeah.
And that struggle eventually leads to independence earned through blood and destruction. And I think there is a break with the past in the sense there's continuity in people and ideas, but Atatürk establishes the republic, and with it is the forging of a new kind of covenant between the people and the state, getting rid of the sultanate and the caliphate, and other reforms that he makes, including for women. I think one of the most impressive reforms for women, besides the civil code of 1926, is appointing women as federal judges. I mean, that empowers them to make decisions over men. And I remember I've seen, European newspapers at this time, in 1930, saying, Turkey is the second European country to allow women to become federal judges.
Yes.
So he builds a new Turkey with some continuity and departure, but the independence and the republic create a new phase for the rest of the century for the Turkish people and other people in Anatolia.
And, we Turkish women feel very proud by the rights we gained through Atatürk. The right to vote, the right to join politics. My other grandmother was one of the first ladies to be chosen into the council. She was the first woman. And about the dress code, she had said to me, she was my father's mother, she was a very modern woman, and she had a career. She was a teacher in the Ottoman Empire, but of course wearing the black hijab. And my grandfather, who was a doctor in the Ottoman Empire, said to my grandmother, now you have to wear this coat and we go outside and no headscarf and women see you, men see you. So you set an example to Atatürk's revolutions. And my grandmother, who was very modern when I was growing up, said to me she was so shy, so embarrassed to go out with a coat rather than a hijab. So those people came a long way with the revolutions of the Republic. That was a very abrupt change from the social life of the Ottoman side and the social side of
Exactly.
the Republic.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I heard from many Turkish women, which I agree and disagree a little bit, is the term like state feminism. This was something that Atatürk gave us. But as you mentioned, for women to step out, to have support for men, it was a revolutionary. It required some courage.
Yeah.
So that Atatürk is not everywhere to make sure that women are treated properly.
Yeah.
It requires some courage by numerous different peoples for this to be realized in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
It was difficult for women to go to a dance. I remember one time Atatürk had a dance at his farm, and I think 2 or 3 women came, and one of them complains to me, you know, you got all these men and just a few of our women. Why didn't they bring their women with them? It took courage too, so that it is top-down given, but it also requires forces from below. And I like the example too of in one of the, I mean, I don't know how much it happened in schools. You know, you integrate boys and girls together in the high school is the last one. First you get the grade schools integration, then you go with junior high. Finally, you know, because of puberty and all that, we're going to go with integrated high schools. And some of the high schools, I think what they did is the girls sat in the front, boys sat in the back in the classrooms, the reverse of a mosque. And then the principal says, we'll let the girls out 10 minutes early out this door, the boys out 10 minutes later out this door, so they don't mingle. So at least we don't have this problem of parents worrying about what's happening on this public space after class, and they're mingling. So it shows you the difficulties at the local level of trying to make this thing work somehow.
Yes, even a very well-educated lady, a teacher, was so embarrassed to wear a coat and go out. Tradition is very strong, and it's very difficult to change traditions.
I remember the last thing when I was in Turkey doing research for my dissertation, it would have been, I think, 77 or 78. I can't remember exactly here. We were on a bus coming from the eastern part, and a Turkish woman gets on the bus with us. She's dressed in very traditional clothes, not a hijab, but, you know, very traditional. Then as she gets closer to Ankara, certain things start to come off. By the time she gets to Istanbul, modern clothes. But along the way, she made changes. So when we visited a village, my wife and I back then, we got on the bus out in the village area. All the men were in the front, all the women with hijabs in the back, and we were right in the middle between the two as a couple. So these things were not easy to implement. And Atatürk, I think, was wise to understand it. When it comes to women, these changes have to take time and have to go not forced down. We can force schools to open. We can force professions to start accepting women, but we're not going to go after the dress with legal system and all that stuff, because it goes against too much the family traditions, and we need to respect it.
Okay, let's go on to Mudanya and then finish off with Mudanya.
Okay, I didn't study it much. All I can say is he showed that when the army moved up, he had to apply pressure. So he moved it into the neutral zone. And then I found a command that he gave the army and said, don't make any moves without me knowing, because he knows that a little incident, a shooting, can lead to a fire. Next thing we know, we got a major confrontation taking place. And Inanu says it was dangerous. We were walking kind of like on a tightrope, because if something happened and shooting starts, you can't control it. And then it developed. But the pressure was to be put on, and he tried to maintain tight control so things would get out of hand. Meanwhile, he sends Inanu to meet with the Allied generals and negotiate. The Greek general appears a little bit later, but the Greeks have to leave. They've left Anatolia, but they're going to have to leave Thrace. So he has attained an armistice that is going to set the stage for then the Treaty of Lausanne, when it comes, that independence will come with some restrictions on the Straits area. But he's attained a political diplomatic victory, with the idea eventually in 1936 he gets control of the Straits.
Yeah.
So he realizes, make some compromise down the road, we'll make things work for our benefit.
Good. Well, thank you very much. And tell me about the next book you're writing. You told me just before we started that you are now planning to write another book.
Well, actually, I have finished the manuscript is done, and I'm awaiting a response from a press. What I wanted to do is, I felt Atatürk's military career has not been studied well. So that was my first book. But then I realized that he's still a soldier. And in what ways is he a soldier? And how does that carry over into the Republic, to better understand his thinking as he has to think as a statesman and as a soldier? So I decided to write a second book that builds a little bit on what I found for this book, but focuses on the Republic period and the reforms that he makes. So 2/3 of the manuscript deals with 1923 on till his death, and looks at the Republic that he establishes with some of the new research that's come out about this period, and also carefully looking through some things that have been ignored in his speeches, and looking at his speeches and actions. So it is a study of him and the Republic as a leader.
That
and
will be
found
very
some interesting things. For example, you mentioned war is cinsiyet. Can you say it is a murder or a crime?
Murder.
Murder is better.
Murder. I said murder. In Turkish, he said cinayet.
So it's murder is better. Okay.
Cinayet is more along the line of murder.
Yeah. And for the civics book in 1930 that he lets Afet Inan put her name on it, then it's 31. In there, he talks about the army and war, and he says the battlefield is bloody in war. And he says you have to realize, and this is for high school students, that commanders have to make merhametsizlik decisions. Yeah. And that is recognizing the brutality of war, the difficult choices, the problems of conscience, really, that you have as a commander. And that's pretty amazing. When I tell that to Americans, we would probably not expect that in a high school book in our country. Oh, so anyway, thank you so much for inviting me and making me feel relevant again.
Thank you very much for having this chat with me. And let's do one in the future about Bosnia, because Bosnia suffered a lot and probably needs our attention.
Thank you again.
Okay, thanks very much. Good evening.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.